Welcome back to the morning show here on the Raj News. Joining us now is the Executive Secretary of the Nigerian Content Development and Monitoring Board, Simbi Wabote, who is on a mission to grow value retention in the Nigerian oil and gas value chain from the current 28% to 70%, while creating 300,000 direct jobs. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And what would you say is the biggest win for the Nigerian oil service companies, really following the establishment of your agency?
Well, biggest win, lots of wins perhaps, for the service industry. Prior to the establishment of the agency, all service activities, in the strict definition, were managed by international companies. The Schlumbergers of this world, the Halliburtons, Baker Hughes of this world. Today, I can boldly say that 80% of the oil service activities within the swamp and the land locations are managed strictly by Nigerians. That's a huge win. And then when you talk about activities related to the oil and gas sector, maybe perhaps because that's my forte, so I can differentiate between services and also other activities, fabrication, for instance. Hitherto, before the act itself, everything was fabricated outside the country. Today, we can boast of 60,000 metric tons of fabrication activities in country. We've established 5 world-class fabrication facilities. And one of the huge wins, if I will use borrow that cliche for you, it's the first time in Africa where we were able to integrate an FPSO in this country here in Lagos. I'm sure most of you saw that huge facility when it came ashore. We were also able to fabricate 6 modules out of the 12. This has never been done in Africa, never been done in Nigeria, but we're able to do it in country. People challenged us, people doubted if we will be able to meet the time schedule. I can also boldly tell you that we were ready months before the FPSO arrived, even before the hull and other modules were fabricated in South Korea. So it's been a huge achievement. And then when you go back to the indigenous operators, today Nigerians perhaps are dominating the swamp and field production activities. For example, Seplat, one of the flagship of a local content achievement, when they took over that field from Shell, I recall Shell was producing mere 10,000 barrels per day from that Obain axis that they took. Today, they're producing almost 75,000 barrels per day of oil, listed in the London and Johannesburg Stock Exchange. So these are just a few examples of a huge achievements we've recorded in the oil and gas sector.
If I may just cut in there, despite these achievements you have mentioned, yesterday the National Bureau for Statistics came out with the GDP growth for the 3rd quarter of the year. And oil and gas accounted for just 9.8% of the GDP. Not much seemed to be. So despite this achievement, it's like we're still very far from the goal.
I think it's important to differentiate, in my view, of the GDP figures. What I read is that non-oil sector does not mean that oil and gas did not in a way contribute. When you look at how you extrapolate GDP figures, you talk about employments that are created. Yeah, and if you look at the value chain of the oil and gas business, it's not only about the crude oil that we produce. It goes a long way in terms of how many fabrication yards you have created, how many people have you employed. So the impact of the oil and gas activity is got direct, indirect, and induced effect. So part of the induced effect, I believe, would have accounted for the growth in GDP if you dissect it in that manner. So this is a tremendous achievement, because if you go to the nitty-gritty of where those things were created, because don't forget, oil and gas activity is not just oil and gas. If I bring in a rig, for instance, I will require helicopters that will service the rigs offshore. I will therefore have to buy those helicopters. People will have to operate them. People will be employed. The caterer that will cook the food, that will feed the people out there in the rig, are also accounted for. So once you spin an oil and gas activity, the value chain is just endless. So if you extrapolate the actual impact, not the direct oil and gas contracts or sales of crude oil or extraction of crude oil, but the indirect and induced effect is quite enormous. That also accounts for the total GDP when you calculate it.
Okay. Yeah. So you have this Nigerian Content Intervention Fund, yeah, which is meant to provide, obviously, funding for local companies in the oil and gas sector. So how much is being funded, and how accessible is this fund? And also, what's the interest rate?
How borrower-friendly is this fund?
Borrower-friendly?
No, I think if there is any organization that's been bold enough to talk about how much is in the kitty in the fund and how the fund is being managed transparently, is the Nigerian Content Development and Monitoring Fund. At every forum, I have given figures. At every forum, I've talked about how we've been able to make this fund available for contributors to the fund. Don't forget, that fund is contributed by the Nigerian vendors who participate in the oil and gas sector. Okay. Today, 1 year ago, we established, in conjunction with the Bank of Industry, a $200 million loan for Nigerian businesses that are contributors to the fund. The fund has 5 products: manufacturing, contract financing, equipment financing, project financing, and community contractors financing. And it has an all-interest rate of 8%, 5-year duration in terms of the loan period, and the interest rate is not going to change for that 5 years. This is unbelievable. Imagine that you get a loan for 8% compared to what you get if you deal directly with the commercial banks. So it's an innovation. It has changed the game, and a lot of companies are trying to access the fund. But again, we're being very careful and meticulous in the way we manage it, because you don't want people to think there's free money anywhere. You don't want people to take that money. At the end of the day, they are not able to do anything, and then you invite AMCOM to come and buy over their assets. No. So we go through a very rigorous process in order for you to access the fund. So it's not something you just think it's there, I'm going to get it. We also know that in the oil and gas sector, most of the vendors are also highly leveraged to the commercial banks. So the process of accessing the fund is taking some bit of time, but as of today, we have disbursed, by the last time I checked, last week, $21 million to beneficiaries. Oh, wow. And Bank of Industry, from the reports they gave me, between now and mid next year, they will be asking for more funds to support Nigerian businesses. So it's an innovation. Our stakeholders are happy, and other sectors are trying to see how they could borrow that model or copy the model. Is this the shippers? Is this the vessel owners? So it's
so at what
fantastic.
Interest rate are you?
8%, all in. All in 8% for 5 years. It's not going to change. Don't forget, these funds are contributed by the same people, but what you want to do, you want to be sure that those who borrow it are able to pay back so that others can benefit, because you can't satisfy everybody at the same time. So you want to make it revolve, as the case may be.
So what will you consider as the biggest challenge to in-country capacity development in the oil and gas sector?
I think there's no gainsaying. The biggest challenge is infrastructure, power, which, of course, this present administration is doing everything they can to address. Also, the road networks that are being fixed. You can imagine if you want to get pipes from Abuja down to the south where it is needed for operations. It will take you about 5-6 days to travel, all that add to cost. So that's the biggest challenge. The other challenge, again, of course, has to do with financing, which is where we have come to bring in the intervention fund to help in that regard, because the authors or the founding fathers of the Act itself also knew that as a huge challenge. But the first one is not within our remit to address, but I think the government, the current government is positioned to a large extent to dealing with those problems. It's not something you can solve with the flicker of a switch. It takes time, and I think methodologically they are dealing with that challenge. So that's also a challenge. And I think the other bit, again, is projects, is activities coming through the funnel well enough to also use the capacities that have been established and sustain those capacities.
If I may just follow up there, there's been this accusation that some of what we call local content, local investors, are actually just frontmen for foreign investors, foreign oil companies, and masquerading as, oh, these are local content. How do you see through this?
I think that insinuation is not correct. For people who are oil and gas practitioners, they know what it is. I'll give you some bit of example. Before the enactment of the Act, on a yearly average, Nigeria spends $20 billion year on year in the oil and gas sector. Only about 3% of that remained in the country. I mean, I spent 26 years in the oil and gas sector, and I know authoritatively that before now, everything we did outside the country. The only thing we were not able to do is to take the oil out of the ground from outside the country. So we did everything, and then we brought those modules here, we brought those rigs here, we brought those platforms here just to take the oil out. But today, that has changed. We've been able to retain more than 10% of that spend in country. About 30% of the spend is kept in country. $5 billion out of the $25 billion we have kept in the country. And our aspiration is that in the next 10 years, we must bring back about $14 billion of the $24 billion annual spend. Prior to the Act itself, the total expenditure outside this country, the oil for the 50 years was about $350 billion. Imagine that only less than 3% of that stayed in country, because then Nigeria believed in taxes, royalties as our benefit from the oil and gas sector. But that has changed. I gave you statistics and example of operating companies that are being managed by Nigerians. Seplat, ITO, Eruton, these are all 99% managed by Nigerians. I recall my days in the oil and gas sector. Hardly will you see a Nigerian as a director in the international companies. Today, almost 80% of the directors, I was a director in Shell before I left, 80% of the directors in those companies are Nigerians. So the signs are there. Everybody can see the strides we have made, the benefits to the country, and the potential if we continue in this trajectory.
So this is your forte, the oil and gas, but the Local Content Act and your board seems to focus more on the upstream. How about the downstream and the midstream of the oil and gas sector? Don't you think that content and capacity should also be developed in those segments?
I think that's a very important question, and I really appreciate it. I think, quite rightly so, the board started focusing on the upstream sector, because when you look at the spend in terms of how much money is spent between the upstream and the downstream, it's quite significant. It's about 70 to 30%. So quite naturally, you will want to focus on the area of your heavy spend. But for the past 2 years, we have changed gear to look at the downstream and the midstream sector on how Nigerians will participate. I give you an example. Only recently, we had to catalyze the establishment of a modular refinery with Walter Smith, where we took an equity participation such that that could come on board to produce about 5,000 barrels per day. There are a lot of them in the works. We're also working actively to participate in the LPG penetration in the country, which is in line with the 7 big wins and the presidential initiative to see how we get LPG to the market. So we are actively participating in that sector, manufacturing of cylinders, and also encouraging businesses to establish, if you like, refining of gas to extract LPG. So we have now switched the gear, looking at the downstream value chain, as well as monitoring the downstream activities in the oil and gas sector.
All right. So other than that content intervention fund that we mentioned earlier, how do Nigerian companies get access to long-term funding?
I think very important question. We have about 2 schemes, the Content Intervention Fund, and then there are our own direct intervention funds. The direct intervention funds has the leverage for long-term funding depending on the investment you want to put on ground within the oil and gas value chain. Don't forget, unfortunately for most of the potential beneficiaries, we go through a very rigorous process because we don't want to end up with perhaps failed projects. We are also very mindful of the sinusoidal nature of the oil and gas business. Today, price is here, tomorrow is there, and once the price comes down, it affects the business. So all that we put into the process and looks at the economics of such investment. So yes, there is available opportunity for long-term funding.
Well, you must be proud of Niger Doc and Lador. These are poster organizations for the local content. But I want to localizing the local content. These are all in the Lagos axis. What are you doing in the Niger Delta where the oil is being extracted? The Bayelsa governor was commending your organization for citing your headquarters in Bayelsa. So localizing the local content.
No, I think one point to be made is that what we call it is Nigerian content. It's not just a regional initiative. It is for the entire country. But we must also be mindful of citing some of these activities where the oil is really being extracted from. So we take initiatives and decisions based on needs and based on sustainability. Niger Doc and Ladol are in Lagos. I don't know if you've been able to also visit the On-Air logistics base. It's one of the world's best logistics base you can ever. That's in Port Harcourt. Yes. If you visited the EWT yard, which is also a huge fabrication yard in Port Harcourt, the Avion yard, which is also huge, and perhaps the Saipem yard, which is even bigger than what you have in Niger Doc. So we are not only localizing, we are going as far as communities to establish these capacities in country. So we do it based on sustainability, not just for doing its sake. So it's quite widespread in terms of, and again, why is it in Lagos? It also brings value in terms of the proximity to freight activities and also marine activities as such. So we try to spread everything we do around the country. And of course, our head office is in Yenagoa, Bayelsa State, which is also good, which of course tries to take the business down to the state level and the community level. But we cannot concentrate everything in one area.
I like that word, spread.
Yes.
Right.
It will get to my village.
And on that note, we'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Simbi Wabote. We hope to see that more jobs are created and your board seems to spread this local content indeed and have more Nigerians on board. Many thanks for coming on the morning show.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, it's now time for another short break. And when we come back, environmentalist Jennifer Uchendu will be showing and telling us how we can all be involved in making the environment clean. Please stay with us.